Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast, your go-to hub to learn insights and the latest developments in the wild and wonderful world of Web3. I'm Alec Burns.
And I'm Jack Davies. Tune in each week as we navigate and explore the rapidly emerging landscape of the Web3 technologies, projects, and ideas that are shaping the future of the internet.
We'll be talking to the best and brightest in the industry to keep uncovering insights,
so that hopefully we can all learn together on our journey to untangle Web3. Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we're delighted to be joined on the show by Luca Arigo. As co-founder of Metaverse Architects and founder of Decentraland Architects, Luca is a serial entrepreneur in the Web3 space who is helping to bring the metaverse to life. Luca is also a key figure in the wider technology scene of Malta, where he supports fellow founders and technologists through the Nomad Visa program. So, without further ado, Luca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jack. Hi, Alec. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
Oh no, man, it's all good. The moment you mentioned Malta, there's a feast week that happens for Santa Maria. Personally, I'm working this week, but the whole island is up in kind of like outdoor celebrations.
Oh wow! No wonder you're smiling so much. That sounds great. So yeah, why don't we kick things off then, Luca? So why don't you tell us about your career and what led you into the Web3 space?
Sure. So I started out in kind of business entrepreneurship quite a few years ago when I was just 18, building kind of like tourism companies and that sort of thing. But then during COVID is when I decided to use like those same skills of digital marketing and sales and dabble in a new industry for which was for me was Web3 and Metaverse and kind of the cross-section of virtual worlds and NFTs and digital currency. So that's like how I got into the Decentraland Architects and then eventually went on to co-found Metaverse Architects.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, we've already mentioned the word metaverse a number of times, right? So this is clearly your area of expertise, and we've talked about it a fair few times on the podcast already. But we've tried to define it ourselves, but I'm sure you'll probably give a more dialed answer than we could. So yeah, for you, what is the metaverse? Could you give us a kind of an overview of how you see it?
Yeah, I'll give you an explanation, I guess, of Metaverse Architects and like how we define our brand and our name there. Because essentially for us, Metaverse encompasses everything that's on the internet, right? From social media to streaming, to video games, to today, like even having kind of digital currencies in the form of cryptocurrency. I see those as all elements, and even AI as being another element that falls under the idea of the metaverse. Now, we call our company Metaverse Architects because when we look at kind of literature of the metaverse and its kind of Hollywood representation, kind of like from Ready Player One and such, the architect is that person who is designing the infrastructure, designing the economy, and we saw ourselves as kind of being representing that goal for organizations and being a studio that would be able to kind of architect whatever you're trying to create on the internet. A big thing for us is always emerging technology. So we always try to stay at the forefront of that. If I had to kind of go back to when I first got involved, though, because yes, I guess I could be considered an expert, in the field that is new. But when I was first getting into it, obviously I was on my day zero in 2020, 2021 when it came to figuring out how the metaverse and Web3 kind of go together. one thing that I didn't expect is for so much worldwide attention and kind of major brands to actually be trying to adopt this technology over the past kind of 2-3 years. That was a huge surprise for me. And I think that's kind of that's the unique part of being in the entrepreneurship space, and kind of getting a bit more of a feel for how I guess different rise and cycles come and go.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. I've never heard someone define the metaverse as encompassing the entire internet right now. I've only ever heard, say, people describe it as, say, I've heard it described as like the 3D internet, for example. And when most people think of metaverse, they tend to think of, like you say, the Oasis in Ready Player One, this kind of VR based kind of internet where people can interact in in a 3D manner. But it's quite interesting that you define it as encompassing everything. Is that how you see it now, or do you think it just has the potential to encompass everything?
So to give credit to where my kind of philosophy comes from today, a lot of it aligns with Herman Narula's vision of the metaverse. So in his book is really where I think a lot of my inspiration today comes from. Which obviously was not in the beginning. In the beginning, I was, I guess, more mainstream with my thoughts, thinking, just the Ready Player One, the virtual world idea. But Herman Narula really goes even further and opens up the idea of the metaverse even further, where it's actually about the story of humanity, and it's the metaverse 1,000 years ago. We're told, or even further back, we're told in tales and in the form of myths and stories, right? And kind of the metaverse is just the evolving tools we have to tell our stories. So that I really like that philosophy behind it, because then it allows us to think that yes, this is a way for us to represent culture, a way for us, to communicate, and that's what makes us human. Even though a lot of what we're talking about today is digital.
Yeah, I really love that. You're resonating with the gamer inside of me there. And you kind of touched on the thing that I wanted to ask you as a follow-on to that is, why do we need the metaverse? To a lot of people, it's quite intangible, the metaverse. So why do we actually need the metaverse, do you think?
Why do we need the metaverse? So it's like, why do we need the metaverse? I think if we find it entertaining, we'll use it, kind of thing. If in that sense, why do we need it? It's why have I found it useful? For example, is because I'm from a small island, right, Malta, and because of kind of being in the metaverse. If you're selling skins, if you're selling wearables, if you're selling 3D models, it allows you to work with companies all over the world, with people, even talent all over the world, and to kind of create a value which obviously is debatable. If you're a gamer, maybe you understand that a beautiful virtual world is worth working on, investing time in, and designing, because people will spend time in it, right? And then obviously there's commercials involved, etc. So I mean, one. So what's preoccupying my thoughts? Because obviously there are the obvious things you can talk about, like why Roblox is a great example of the commercial potential of a metaverse, even though it's maybe not a Web3 metaverse. But then if I think to, let's say, in the future, or even just this summer, things like global warming might make staying outdoors something that's not possible for certain countries and certain regions. And if you're stuck inside, what can you do? You can socialize, you can create commercial value still online. And I think that is obviously a bit dystopic, but even if you just look at it from a country scenario, if I'm an entrepreneur and I built a business in a virtual world, and my country goes to war, I can leave my country and my virtual business is untouched. So it's like, I guess it's just kind of, those are some, I guess, perks of a digital economy in a sense. But at the end of the day, it could be considered a luxury in many ways, to have a virtual, to have time to kind of spend online, and to have technology, and to have social media and these things. So as a person, I'm still very much in touch with nature as well. So I love to go outdoors and surfing and this sort of thing. So I do have that internal battle of, I love tech, I love spending time online, I love meeting people online, I love socializing and having fun online. But then I also am aware that, listen, I don't want to be just sucked into an online world, right? So maybe I try to
Exactly.
justify it by saying, listen, if the world goes to shit, there's an option online, all right?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think people will find it refreshing that someone is so deep in the metaverse world and building the metaverse also is very much grounded in touch with nature, because that's a lot of people's worries is we're all going to be plugged into the matrix. You see the memes of people just wearing goggles, but trash all lying around them in their bedrooms type thing. I mean, I think people are worried about that, but I
I
agree
think
it's
that's a
important
very
to have this
valid
balance, right?
concern, because technology you can either use it or it can use you, and
Yeah.
that's what I try to. I think a lot of even entrepreneurs talk about social media in that way, where either you're a consumer of it or you can be a creator of it.
Yeah.
So I try to advertise this idea of being a creator is more productive for yourself and kind of for others as well, in a sense.
Sure. Yeah, that makes total sense. I think we often use that same phrasing, and I think if you're going to be one of the two, it makes sense to be trying to be on the creative side. I want to double click quickly on something you said there, because I think there's a really interesting distinction you're bringing in. You mentioned about Roblox not necessarily being a Web3 metaverse. What do you mean by a Web3 metaverse, and how does that differentiate from the kind of the larger definition you kind of started with?
So one thing that's I got into Decentraland and now I'm getting into Roblox. So that's one thing interesting about me, I guess, when it comes to this space. And there's a lot of parallels. So it's really interesting comparing them side by side and the infrastructure that's been built and that's being built kind of ongoingly. They essentially work the same, except the main difference is that instead of Robux, which is a centralized currency in a sense, and Roblox as an organization functions a bit like a bank because they have their own currency that it's and then just comparing that to Decentraland, right? It's the same kind of thing. The technology at Decentraland is inferior if you had to compare it to Roblox. I mean, it doesn't take much brains to realize that what you can build on Roblox is a lot better than what you can build on Decentraland. But then Decentraland has this feature which it's designed more like a free city kind of thing, where people can go set up shop, kind of transact without having to go through a centralized entity. There's a DAO, so there's people there's a political kind of way of trying to govern this space, and like that's interesting in itself. But at the moment, if you asked where are most people or most gamers, if you compare them side by side, there's a lot more traffic on these more established platforms. I think that the way that this technology will be integrated is in a way where from the user side you maybe don't really have a big distinction, and then if you're a platform like Roblox, you don't actually want to have responsibility of keys or this stuff in the hands of children and such. So I am trying to start to understand like how is this going to merge over time. Will platforms like Decentraland over the years be able to create something that's usable for the masses? I mean, if you keep in mind that Roblox has been around since like 2006, 2007, right? Something, or 2008. It's taken a long time to build all of that infrastructure. And some of it you can say is maybe not, I don't know if it's outdated. I wouldn't say so. Minecraft, you could say, would be outdated, but yeah.
So you've kind of talked about two probably the most famous examples of metaverses, that Decentraland and Roblox, and you also started to talk about some of the considerations you have to build into the system when designing a metaverse. You were talking about keys and storing keys and things like this. So what are some of the biggest considerations that you would have when people should look to build a metaverse? What should they really think about based on your experience?
So they need to know what they're trying to achieve. Now, there's a very valid case to go into Decentraland if your target market is the Web3 audience, because it's got one of the strongest communities in the space. There is the media in Web3 usually pick up things that are happening inside of Decentraland. So like there is that argument, But if you're a brand that's looking to reach, millions of people and potentially make profit, Roblox right now is a much kind of richer ecosystem, and there's things that are working together. So one thing that's interesting in Decentraland, for example, is there is a company, an organization called AdShares. They do programmatic advertising on 2D websites, but they also introduced it into Decentraland. Now that's like a third company. That's a third party that's like not controlled by any has any kind of legal relation with Decentraland. Let's set up a business doing billboard advertising. If you compare that to Roblox, in Roblox, that kind of system is inbuilt into the entire kind of ecosystem. So if you wanted to drive traffic to your experience, you can use their kind of Facebook ad management system and kind of have a near guarantee that you can get whatever numbers your KPIs are set at, because they have hundreds of millions of users. So if you're a brand that's trying to reach an entire population of upcoming youth, Roblox is definitely more effective at that. But if you're trying to reach, people who maybe think a bit differently and you want to attract more Web3 people to your company or explore partnerships, or see what your brand can do, kind of using cryptocurrency, like the Decentraland has a lot of openness that allowed us, for example, to build a crypto casino, which in the bear market is probably one of the few Web3 companies that is still generating money, So that's kind of like an interesting kind of way to think about things. But that's obviously not a client you would take to Roblox for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the advertising aspect, because one of the first things I came across when I was, started hearing about the metaverse and looking into it, I can't remember I think it was Roblox. It was either Roblox or Decentraland, but I saw that lots of large companies were buying up land just for advertising. So I think Atari was one example, and they bought tons of plots of land next to each other, like maybe like an eighth of all the land, so that when you go on the map, you just see a big logo straight away. And I found that quite funny as a big corporate kind of trying to muscle in on the advertising game there. You're talking a lot about brands using the metaverse. Is that the kind of client you normally cater for? Are you bringing people like that to the metaverse, or do you also help people build kind of new fresh worlds and like metaverse games from scratch as well?
Yeah, so we already mentioned Herman Nerula. Like, I'm a big fan, maybe, but they do work on some interesting stuff, because they M Squared have released something called Metaverse Markup Language, which is an open source standard. Now, this is something that's really important for the industry, because if this kind of standard gets adopted, what it allows for is essentially, companies like myself to build according to one standard, and then this whatever we build to be portable into Unreal Engine or into Unity and that sort of thing, and for there to be communication as well between these separate kind of worlds. Then they also have their technology, which is the Morpheus multiplayer platform that allows for 10,000 or even further concurrency. So if you wanted to have 10,000 people in one festival all singing the national anthem, you would hear that together, and they've done kind of these examples where you have crowds singing football anthems, in virtual spaces in unison together, which creates a really interesting effect. And I mean, that's what we can build for in terms of like, if a customer wanted something that's completely white labeled with essentially wants to work with that. That's the gold standard at the moment,
Sure.
But in terms of budget and these things, it depends on what you're setting out to achieve, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you brought up like the kind of the issue to an extent with standards in the metaverses, and the portability and all this kind of stuff is something that we talk about quite a lot. That we assume interoperability amongst many metaverses, but that's not the way the industry is going.
Sorry to interrupt you, Alec, because I failed to mention one that it's basically like HTML and CSS, like a kind of like a React that's built for metaverse. I'm not a very amazing coder, but that's the short description of it.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff is super important because we have these like isolated bubbles right now developing in their kind of their own way, and what people expect at the end of the day is one metaverse where everyone can move from place to place and bring their their avatars and characters with them. And the other thing they want to bring with them are their NFTs, and this is a big thing that also probably needs to adopt standards. And I know that you've done a bit around this stuff, but what is the role of like NFTs in the metaverse in your mind?
Communities is a big part of it, So when people, one thing that's working on Twitter, for example, is this idea of subscribing, right, to different influencers. Maybe not everyone likes it, but one advantage is that if you subscribe to someone's Twitter, is that they can open like a group chat for their subscribers only, So being able to create those kind of spaces for your community to interact beyond the Discord channel is essentially what the selling point is for the metaverse technology. Now, when it comes to bringing in your clothing and this sort of thing, Decentraland has a feature which I think other platforms might be adopting by now, which essentially, if you, let's say, you're a Bored Ape holder, if you enter their platform, it will recognize you're holding a Bored Ape, and it's it's programmed to display what you should look like, as your avatar in that sense. I mean, Ready Player Me is doing it in a more centralized way, but it still works. There's different ways to achieve it, I guess. But
Yeah.
then, in terms of true interoperability, I don't know. I like how far we'll get overnight. I think interoperability is something that happens like over a spectrum, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so like I mean, what you're
Trade-offs.
describing there is like the idea of like avatars bringing in like their own collectible. So what I think you're saying is that it's around like the social currency aspect, right? Like this is a representation of who I am in like a metaverse that I provably own these NFTs, and I can say that I own this Bored Ape, or I'm the top subscriber to this particular artist. And do you think that's very important to people? Do you think that the metaverse needs these kind of things to be successful?
Yes, for sure. It's interesting for a client, we're putting in their traditional artwork into their build, like, and displaying their traditional artwork. So they own a lot of expensive artwork in real life, and we're showing them off online. But obviously, there's no way of kind of provably showing evidence of ownership, unlike with NFTs. I mean, that's showing kind of having your own galleries already a part of it. I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see massive roadblocks though to kind of using NFTs inside of metaverse platforms. I think there's kind of quite a clear format for how to do it. I think the biggest issues are that there's only kind of like one platform at the moment, which is kind of open source and allows anyone to kind of come in and do other things. I mean, at the moment, you have a lot of NFT projects which are associated with different metaverse platforms that have legally binding IP clauses that only allow them to be present in one place, So there's all kinds of challenges to interoperability, some of them to do with normal copyright, I guess. But
yeah, I think it's interesting that while we're talking about NFTs, for me, it's interesting your definition of the metaverse being kind of encompassing anything on the internet, and this idea of how you tell stories, how you do any kind of interaction on the web. I feel like NFTs were maybe the first and best example of interoperability breaking through in Web3, because you saw big platforms like your Instagram, I think it was Instagram, and Twitter definitely. I think you're now able to. You can tell I haven't got any particularly valuable NFTs myself, but I'm pretty sure you can now set it as your avatar, and it'll link out to the blockchain records, right, or on OpenSea and things like that. And that to me is an example of something in one domain of the internet and Web3, like something that lives on the blockchain, then appearing in a website and a social media platform. So even though for a lot of people NFTs aren't necessarily the most interesting thing on the face of it, I think they really did show the first success case of interoperability in my view. Definitely. I mean, do you have any thoughts on what that whole process when they became popularized? Because you'll obviously have lived through that period yourself,
For them to
during
be
lockdown.
integrated, like for them to be integrated properly into games, I think like the minting fees need to go, obviously, kind of thing. That those are the obvious issues, I guess. I mean, I had even run an Axie guild for a short while. I had set
Really?
up Axie teams in the Philippines. I'm still in touch with one of the guys who used to help me manage them. Like these are all awesome people, kind of thing. Like, and it was a social. It felt like we were doing a social experiment. Like just putting money in, it's going to people who are playing a game that's kind of like an interesting game, but then obviously there were issues to kind of like this to how the game was marketed. It was being described as an investment and this sort of thing, you know and those were the issues I saw, like kind of that people are being promised that they're going to get rich on this sort of thing, like when the value that's generated a game should, I guess, come about because of sentiment, like tradability, scarcity, kind of like, you know, going back to thinking about things like Pokemon cards, right? That's
Yeah.
what I think Gary Vee got very right, is that he thought of the things as collectibles and really pushed in this idea that in 20, 30 years, you're going to be glad you held on to it. It's not,
Yeah.
that's I mean, there are some parts of the Decentraland which have that element. There's this very core community that really, really love the brand and love the ecosystem. The earliest mints are bought up, like, and owned by different individuals. Like, it does have those elements to it.
Yeah.
But I again, like, maybe I've been involved in it for too long to be objective.
Yeah. I think you're totally right. Like collectibles has probably been around since the dawn of maybe civilization. Like it's so intrinsic to humanity. We love collecting things. It's gone from like,
The Neanderthals with their baseball cards, right?
well, they probably had nice shells and nice rocks, I imagine it started out as. But like, it's just, we get it. And I think it's one of the reasons why like NFTs kind of make sense to a lot of people, even if it is like very kind of used by gamers right now specifically, because I think maybe the social aspect is probably a bit more understandable by gamers. Like the idea to say, look, let me show you who I am and what I've done and all these things that I own. And I think gamers have adopted it, but I think it is going to be pushed more and more to like other people in the space and other sectors of society. Like the way that you think of like your Instagram and your LinkedIn profile representing who you are. I imagine NFTs will be that in the future on your Web3 wallet. This is what you like. This is what you own. This is, who you are as an actual person in a much more provable and efficient way. And there's a lot of excitement coming from that stuff. And
I like the idea of organizations a lot. So DAOs for me are an important part of kind of the potential of NFTs and kind of these online communities. Because when you look at it from this perspective over the years, the power has shifted from different organizations. Many, hundreds of years ago, the most powerful institution would have been the church. And the church was a group of people who are rallied behind a mission and a way of set of beliefs and values, and that's how society kind of was controlled and organized. That's what an organization should do, right? Organize things. And then over time, we had things like companies come around, like the Dutch East India Company and these things, which those were innovations for their time. They created a new way of organizing human resources and human labor and human kind of activity. And, then governments kind of took over from kings and queens and that sort of thing. And, over time, we've had things like foundations and NGOs and these sort of organizational structures. And I think DAOs are going to be obviously, well, not obviously, but for me, they're the most logical organization for virtual communities to be governed by. Like at present, there's a lot of kind of wrong ways of doing a DAO, and there's a lot of kind of different learning curves that I feel like a lot of different DAOs have been going through for many years, maybe longer than most people thought, because the idea of a DAO sounds simple. But I strongly believe that kind of we'll have governments that are brave enough start legislating and creating the first legal identities. And once you have a legal identity, then you would allow these organizations to have real world bank accounts, to own real world assets. And that's even more important, because then these virtual communities will have a physical space, their church, go and and kind of hang out, and share ideas and share values and that sort of thing.
I really like how you've described that. I wonder if you've read the book *Sapiens*, because the author of *Sapiens* kind of makes the description in a similar way. He's like, we had for many hundreds of thousands of years, we had tribes of 150 people, and that's because we could only remember enough details about 150 people to interact properly. And then all of a sudden, we started to develop faith and religion, and it allowed us to grow our tribes to much greater society sizes, because we kind of knew there was shared values across these tribes. And then that moved to politics and countries and states, and then that moved to businesses, like you were saying. And it's really interesting to see that you think that the final form of this is DAOs, and that's like the end goal. And it's kind of like a shift in faith from these groups to maybe a shift in faith to technology to a certain extent, and maybe a shift in faith to the more decentralized approach. But like you say, we need the kind of the legal recognition of these things to actually kind of give the faith that these can actually go forward and be maybe the most efficient way of governing these kind of online bodies, which is it's exciting, right?
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned *Sapiens*. Definitely, I think it's like a merge of *Sapiens* and Ray Dalio's *Changing World Order* kind of thing.
Yeah.
But where kind of my opinion on where the changing world order is going to go is that kind of these digital economies are going to grow to the size of countries, where some of them already have, and obviously that's maybe in 20 years or 30 years time, or even longer or shorter, I don't know what happens. They could, the influence of these organizations will have more kind of tangible kind of effects. And usually when there's major crisis, is that kind of the time to shine can always come around, right?
Yeah, we already saw obviously the good example of that was they nearly bought the Constitution, right? Constitution DAO very nearly actually managed to buy the US Constitution, which would have been a pretty big moment and a bit of a statement for the DAO community.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the interesting things about your kind of vision of DAOs being, larger than countries and larger than enterprises currently, which I could totally see in the future. A big thing for me would be the accountability aspect. Like, who is accountable if something goes wrong? 52% of this potentially 1 billion sized DAO, and then something happens with that decision that goes fundamentally wrong. How is accountability measured there? It's kind of similar to what we're seeing with like smart cars. And it's like, if the program goes wrong and there's 100 million cars using the same program, what happens when something goes wrong and there's a car crash? And there's kind of a public challenge there where people find it hard to actually get across that there's an accountability issue where they don't know who to blame, and there's not someone that they can penalize in that case. And I wonder if this is going to be a limit on the DAO's kind of rise to power potentially.
It's an interesting thing to mention. Like, so because you mentioned the electric cars, the autonomous cars. So one way I've heard that kind of an argument on that is that like autonomous cars, if we're being logical, don't have to not ever kill anyone. They just have to kill less people than humans do when driving. But because of this kind of like legal query, like who's the responsibility if it does happen, it kind of freezes us from saying let the AI drive the cars, And I feel it's a bit the same with the DAO question kind of thing. Like, what happens with the legal liability? It might just mean that we need to compromise, where ultimately there needs to be a founder who is liable and willing to take the risk of being liable to something he's not in control of.
Well,
that like might take some interesting legal precedents, because if he's not found liable, and then through a court case you find certain members were the actual culprits, then you go and do so. But I mean, it's like that's. If a country does, if a government does something wrong, is the prime minister always responsible? No, not really.
That's true. I'm imagining like an Elon Musk taking all liability for all Tesla crashes that ever happen.
Right, exactly. Same thing with a company, right? Like, so there is some way of I think it just takes the willingness to figure it out, and different countries will always legislate in slightly different ways. So some countries will decide to legislate in one way, some will decide to legislate in another way, and that's good because as entrepreneurs and DAOs, you have choice, and then let the best system win.
Yeah, that's maybe a nice segue onto talking about where you're based, right? Because you're obviously based in Malta. And I was going to say, is it good being based there for Metaverse Architects? I presume you'll kind of work in a distributed manner anyway, as you said earlier. But I'd like to know, what's the scene like in Malta? Is there something particular that you love about that?
Yes, I mean, like Malta has been a great place to grow up. It's an interesting part of the world, being that like we're just in the center of the Mediterranean, Europe to the north, Africa to the south. Kind of, it's a very multicultural place. So growing up, I was always, especially like after 18 and onwards, hanging out with a lot of expats and going to like digital nomad events and that sort of thing, where there is a network. If you're not Maltese, I happen to be Maltese. It's a fantastic jurisdiction for your company or for yourself if you're looking to not to kind of have a good lifestyle, but also a low tax environment and a friendly business environment in that sense. A very interesting country in terms that the government has proven over like 30, 40 years, whether it was one government or the other, because there's two kind of major political parties. It's kind of has proven to always create new laws that are sometimes a bit brave for their time. So it's done this in the maritime industry in, I think, the 80s, 90s. And then it's done it with creating some of the first offshore customer support in the early 2000s. And then regulating the gambling industry for the first time in the European Union. And then in 2017, maybe some guys from Web3 would remember this concept of the blockchain island and this idea that Malta is going to be creating the best regulatory system for Web3. Obviously, it wasn't perfect when it was launched, but it was very forward-looking. So today, when you look at the MiCA regulation of the that's been released by the European Union, I think the Commission released it. A lot of it is based actually on the original laws that Malta wrote, and since then has rewrote. So it is quite a confident jurisdiction kind of for Web3 companies, as in there's a lot of good examples. But I mean, personally, it's not the best jurisdiction if you're Maltese, which is an interesting thing.
Oh, really?
Because yes, and this is some mistake a lot of governments are doing in today's time. So if you are a Portuguese citizen, you don't benefit from the same kind of treatment as if you were a British or a Maltese or a Canadian, which is causing a lot of entrepreneurs who are from one country to say, hey, I might be better off if I move somewhere else. So it's quite interesting to see that.
Yeah, I've always had this impression of Malta, like as you say, as being kind of at the forefront of blockchain in particular. Yeah, the whole blockchain island thing was definitely was my association with Malta, really. And I remember there being lots of conferences, lots of money flowing towards projects there. So I didn't realize maybe it wasn't so good for Maltese people, but
No,
yeah,
I mean it's not bad for Maltese people. I wouldn't say it's bad for Maltese people.
No,
I as in you mentioned something else that I work on, which is Nomad Visa Malta, is a service that helps kind of digital nomads move here, kind of thing. But I do encourage other Maltese entrepreneurs to really get out of the country, to travel, because one thing that Maltese startups sometimes suffer from is thinking too small. It's a very small country, small population, and you don't have that way of thinking as you do in bigger countries like the UK or the United States, where there's millions of people who have never heard of you, and you need to think with a much bigger kind of mindset,
Got you. So you kind of alluded to Maltese startups and I think just before we started recording that you just gave us some other news about a new startup that you potentially have. I'd love to hear a bit about it.
All right, cool. Yeah, so this is it's exciting because I think I'm in such a good mood because I've just been talking about like my new startup for the past couple of weeks. It's my favorite thing to do, to kind of create a new story. You know, today we spoke about the importance of stories, and like I think startups are all entirely about having a story, and in some way it's an open-ended story, right? So
Hmm.
things continue to unfold. But I am back in December of 2022. I was looking at the generative AI space, and I noticed obviously that there were these projects, you know, creating lookalikes of people's avatars. You know, you could enhance what you look like and that sort of thing. Now, what my thoughts were over there was that like this technology is going to continue to evolve, and I want to potentially like get into it somehow in a similar way I did with Metaverse Architects, and that's where this idea of creating a model agency that's targeting the fashion industry, but it is entirely AI generated. So my process for starting, you know, a company is usually to find, you know, a website, preferably a .com. I do go for keyword specific business names because the SEO advantage when you're bootstrapping and you don't have like a lot of funds is really, really helpful. And registering, you know, AI model agency essentially allowed me to test inside of this new idea whether people are even searching for the solution. And what I found from December up until, you know, June, which is when I started to say, okay, there's real potential here, was a lot of businesses actually reached out to me at AI Model Agency, and I was just looking for solutions that I could potentially offer to them. You know, since then I've had potential clients who were from, for example, Saudi Arabia, gold jewelers, and one issue they have is that for models to try on their gold jewelry, they need to send it to their influencers in another country.
Yeah.
And that's obviously shipping, it's risky, and the biggest problem is that sometimes it doesn't get sent back to to the owner.
Yeah. Wow.
So and in Saudi it's sometimes hard to find different diverse models who would like to show skin. So there was a number of issues to solve over there. Back then, I couldn't kind of actually service this client because I was still learning more about the AI generative field. But now we can actually do this sort of thing, like where the technology is moving along fast enough. I don't really need to invest that much in kind of building AI products because so many amazing entrepreneurs out there have already built very good products that I have subscriptions with, you know.
Yeah.
And we're basically building a business around offering this as a service. Now we're creating a portfolio of AI generated models, which will look exactly like a model agency's catalog, because essentially an agency is a very simple business that has a catalog of headshots. And in a B2B deal, you simply say, I want this one, and that one. And we're going to replicate that same kind of business over there.
Wow.
In the meantime, I created a dress generator. It was a very quick kind of like 30-day sprint at wearme.ai. And it's essentially just generates wedding dresses, like you select different features. And that is in itself did 56 sales, like from
Oh,
December
wow.
till now as well. And like kind of there is some scope to create a better version of that that's more wide and can generate any dresses. But I'm taking things like day by day, partnering with some really
Yeah.
interesting people. So kind of putting together a team and trying to generate, you know, some revenue and some real cases with clients.
Yeah.
And hopefully bootstrapping another cool business for the next few years.
That's really cool. I think the idea of like, so right now you're generating what, 2D images, right? 2D AI generated images for models. Have you thought about kind of bringing together your metaverse work and, you know, the current new AI work to start to have AI generated content in 3D spaces as well?
Yes, I mean that stuff's coming, and we're including AI in part of our workflows, and at the moment as much as possible. I think the next thing for every agency is getting a bit more hands-on with things like Runway, which allow for video and this sort of thing, because we can do more than just kind of creating 2D images that are good for a fashion shoot, but also looking into the marketing and creating, ads and the entertainment, creating short, maybe music videos and this sort of thing. Crossover with Metaverse, but bit by bit, I guess.
Well, either way, it's nice for us to have our first. I'm gonna claim it as an exclusive on the show. I know you've already got a website, but I think this is the first time you've spoken about it publicly, right? So yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. I think we could probably do with being your first customers for our marketing, so people don't have to see our actual faces anymore. That might be handy.
Well, you know what? If you continue this podcast for the next 50 years, we can keep you looking just as young.
Yeah. Exactly. That would be ideal. I mean, well, let's see if we're here in 50 years. But yeah. So, Luca, as we're coming to kind of the end of the show here, I just want to get your kind of general outlook on the state of metaverse right now. I mean, and what your take is on how things have gone. Obviously, we've had fairly high profile entry into the space from Meta and the Horizon Worlds offering. Like, do you think that's been a success? Do you think these new players have managed to challenge the older ones? And where do you think it's going in the near future?
I mean, that will remain one of the most scariest and exciting moments of my life. My company is called Metaverse Architects, and Facebook just changed their name to Meta. They're gonna sue me, like what? I don't know, but yeah, it brought a lot of attention. It created a lot of unrealistic expectations. It accelerated the industry, but then it created obviously this feeling of a dump, right? Because things got inflated and then kind of got forgotten about in a sense. I just think that even them from their side, they're playing a long game kind of thing. They see the potential in the space. They have the hardware. They're also doing a lot of software. Maybe they announced it so they did it so drastically because they knew Apple will eventually be coming out with their Vision Pro, so they wanted to get into the consumer mindset, this idea of a metaverse to be a Facebook thing. Now Apple doesn't even use the word metaverse; it's spatial computing. So it's sometimes these things. It's just like are they just playing games with the media? What's going on here? But yeah.
Well, thanks, Luca. I mean, it's been really great having you on here. We have one last segment that we ask all our guests, basically, and we want to compare their answers across like the ages, basically. The first question is, in one sentence, what is Web3 to you?
For me, what is Web3 to me? It is, I think, the realization that digital economy can exist. So from the first time I discovered things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, it felt like discovering a new tool, a new invention, right? I'm trying to think. There's something I wanted to compare it to, but so it's
a good answer.
As
we said, that's one of the most insightful answers we've had so far.
You don't need to add anything to that.
Okay, there was a really good comparison, but I forgot it now. So I'll just leave that.
If it comes to you shoot it at us and we'll add it. I think that was a really great answer.
Awesome.
So the second question is, if you could choose anybody, dead or alive, to sit down and discuss Web3 with, who would it be and why?
Yes, I know this. There's a guy, he goes by the name of Joseph Schumpeter, and he was an Austrian economist, most famously known for the idea of creative destruction. And creative destruction is not a scary term, but it's just this kind of. I'd like to talk to him about it and just see how he would look at the world today and how he would compare his theories and thoughts to our current scenario. That's
another great answer. I think that's the first time we've had one of the Austrians mentioned as in that answer to that question. I think that's a really good one. That's probably be up there with me as well. But yeah, so thanks, Luca, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. I've really enjoyed this one. And to those listening, thank you for listening wherever you may be, and join us next time as we untangle a little more of Web3.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.